The transport shuttle's engines hummed with a finality that Margaret Hayes had learned to recognize over 73 years of listening to machinery. It was the sound of something winding down, preparing to leave and never return. She sat on the cracked plasteel bench inside the cramped cabin, her weathered hands folded in her lap, watching the Zorath crew members move with efficient indifference as they unloaded the last of the supplies, if you could call them supplies. 3 boxes. That was all they'd been given. 3 mismatched containers of expired ration packs, a broken water reclamator, and what appeared to be salvaged hull plating that might have once been part of a shelter. Thomas Hayes stood beside her, his tall frame slightly stooped now but still solid, still present. His grey beard was neatly trimmed despite everything, a small act of defiance against the chaos that had consumed their lives over the past 6 months. He placed a calloused hand on her shoulder, and she reached up to cover it with her own. "They're really doing this," she said quietly, not as a question, but as a statement that needed to be spoken aloud to become real. "Yes," Thomas replied, his voice gravelly but steady. "They are." Commander Velkaris descended from the shuttle's upper deck, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming purple-black under the moon's dim twin suns. The Zorath were an imposing species, tall, angular, with compound eyes that reflected light in unsettling patterns and mandibles that clicked when they spoke. Velkaris wore the elaborate shoulder plates of high command, etched with conquest markers that told of 100 subjugated worlds. He looked at Margaret and Thomas the way one might look at broken equipment awaiting disposal. "The colony expedition cannot support non-productive individuals," Velkaris announced, his translator rendering his clicking speech into cold, mechanical words. "Your physical capabilities have deteriorated beyond acceptable parameters. The Empire's resources are finite. You understand this, yes?" Margaret felt Thomas's hand tighten on her shoulder. She kept her voice level, refusing to give the commander the satisfaction of seeing her fear. "We understand that you've decided we're not worth the food we eat," she said. "We understand that our decades of service, Thomas as an engineer, myself as a medic, mean nothing when you calculate value only in muscle and years remaining." Velkaris's mandibles twitched, which Margaret had learned was the Zorath equivalent of a dismissive shrug. "Sentiment is a luxury. The expedition must establish a viable colony on Kepler 442b within the designated time frame. Your presence would compromise mission success probability by 0.73%. The mathematics are clear." 0.73%, Thomas repeated, his voice carrying a bitter edge. "That's what we've been reduced to, a rounding error in your spreadsheet." "Precisely." Velkaris gestured to the barren landscape outside the shuttle. "This moon, designation LK-247, has breathable atmosphere, minimal seismic activity, and sufficient solar radiation for basic survival. The structure here was constructed by a previous survey team. It is damaged but serviceable. You have been provided with tools and provisions." Margaret looked out through the viewport at what Velkaris generously called a structure. The cabin was little more than a crumbling foundation, with 3 walls still standing and a partially collapsed roof. It sat alone on a plateau of grey rock, surrounded by nothing but dust, scattered boulders, and the skeletal remains of some previous failed attempt at colonization, rusted equipment, broken solar panels, fragments of polymer sheeting flapping in the thin wind. The moon itself was a desolate place. 2 small suns hung in a perpetually twilight sky, casting everything in shades of amber and shadow. There was no green anywhere, no water visible, no signs of life beyond the stubborn lichens that clung to rocks in pale, defiant patches. "This is a death sentence," Thomas said flatly, "and you know it. It is an opportunity for dignified conclusion," Velkaris corrected. "Many cultures value the chance to face final days with autonomy, rather than burden their communities. You should be grateful. Grateful." Margaret almost laughed, but the sound died in her throat. There was no point in arguing. The Zorath Empire had made its decision 6 months ago, when the colony ship's medical officer had declared both Margaret and Thomas resource negative, a clinical term that meant they consumed more than they produced. The irony was sharp. Margaret had saved 17 lives during an outbreak of Krellian fever on the ship. Thomas had personally repaired the quantum drive when it had begun to destabilize, preventing a catastrophic cascade that would have killed everyone aboard. But those achievements were in the past, and the Zorath only looked forward, only calculated future utility. "Your supplies will last approximately 40 days if rationed properly," Velkaris continued, consulting a datapad. There is a possibility of rescue should another expedition pass through this sector, though statistical probability is low, 17% over a 5-year period. 17% over 5 years. Margaret did the mental math automatically. 40 days of food. No realistic hope of rescue. This wasn't dignified conclusion. This was abandonment with a veneer of bureaucratic efficiency. 2 Zorath crew members, younger, lower ranking based on their plain armor, carried the supply boxes off the shuttle and deposited them roughly on the ground outside the cabin. One of them, a female named Siraket, had been kind to Margaret during the voyage, sharing extra water rations when the recyclers had malfunctioned. Even now, Siraket's compound eyes seemed to hold something like regret, but she said nothing. Orders were orders in the Zorath military hierarchy. "You have 15 minutes to disembark and secure your belongings," Velkaris said. "We maintain a strict departure schedule." Thomas helped Margaret to her feet. Her knees ached, old injuries from her field medic days, aggravated by months in the ship's inadequate gravity compensation. They gathered their personal items, a worn duffel bag containing clothing, a few photographs printed on old Earth paper, Thomas's engineering tools, and Margaret's medical kit, obsolete by Zorath standards, but irreplaceable to her. As they descended the shuttle ramp, the moon's gravity hit them, lighter than Earth standard, but with an odd lateral pull that suggested the moon's rotation was irregular. The air smelled of metal and dust, dry and thin. Margaret's lungs protested with each breath. The 3 supply boxes sat in the dirt like tombstones. Thomas knelt and opened the first one. Inside were ration packs stamped with Zorath military codes, their expiration dates 5 years past. The second box contained the water reclamator, a crucial piece of equipment, but when Thomas examined it, his expression darkened. "Cracked condenser coil," he muttered, "and the filtration membrane is missing entirely." The third box held the hull plating and a small emergency beacon with a blinking red indicator light that meant its power cell was nearly depleted. Margaret looked back at the shuttle. Velkaris stood at the top of the ramp, watching them with those unreadable compound eyes. For a moment she considered begging. Pride was a luxury they could no longer afford, but something in her spine, some core of steel forged through decades of surviving in a galaxy that had never made things easy for humanity, kept her upright and silent. "Do you have any final requirements?" Velkaris asked, his tone suggesting the question was purely procedural. Thomas stood slowly, his jaw set. "So yeah, I have one requirement." Velkaris waited. "Remember our names," Thomas said quietly. "When you're sitting in your colony, eating your rations and calculating your efficiency percentages, remember that you left Thomas and Margaret Hayes on this moon to die. Remember that we had names, that we had lives, that we mattered. Can you do that, Commander? Or is memory also calculated as non-productive?" For a long moment, Velkaris was silent. Then his mandibles clicked softly. "Your names are already archived in the expedition logs. Section Theta, subsection Mortality Projections. You will not be forgotten." Margaret wasn't sure if that was meant as reassurance or cruelty. With the Zorath, it was often impossible to tell the difference. The shuttle ramp retracted with a hydraulic hiss. The engines spooled up, kicking dust and small stones into a choking cloud. Margaret and Thomas turned away, shielding their faces, and when they looked back, the shuttle was already lifting off, its sleek silver hull catching the amber sunlight as it climbed toward the stars. They watched until it was nothing more than a bright point of light, then nothing at all. The silence that followed was absolute. No birds, no insects, no distant hum of civilization. Just the whisper of wind across stone and the sound of their own breathing. Margaret turned to look at the cabin. Their cabin now, whether they wanted it or not. Up close, it was worse than she'd thought. The walls were cracked polymercrete. The roof had a hole the size of a person, and the door hung askew on corroded hinges. Inside, she could see debris, animal droppings from some long-gone creature, and the twisted remains of furniture that had been scavenged for parts. 40 days, she said softly. Thomas picked up the duffel bag and the medical kit. "Then we'd better make them count." They walked together across the dusty ground toward the cabin, 2 elderly humans on a dead moon, abandoned by an empire that had calculated their worth and found them wanting. Behind them, their footprints marked the dust, the first human marks this place had seen in what might have been decades. The twin suns began their slow descent toward the horizon, and the shadows grew longer. Margaret paused at the cabin's threshold, looking back one last time at the empty sky. "We're not going to die here," she said suddenly. surprised by the conviction in her own voice. Thomas looked at her, one eyebrow raised. No? No. Margaret stepped through the doorway, glass crunching under her shoes. We're going to live here. There's a difference. Thomas followed her inside, and despite everything, despite the abandonment, the broken equipment, the impossible odds, he smiled. Then I suppose we'd better get to work. Outside, the wind continued its lonely song across the rocks, indifferent to human determination or alien cruelty. But inside the broken cabin, two people who had been discarded like faulty machinery began to take inventory of what they had, what they needed, and what they refused to surrender. Hope was not a calculation. It was a choice, and Margaret and Thomas Hayes had just made theirs. The first night on LK-247 was colder than Margaret had expected. The twin suns set quickly, their amber light fading to a deep purple twilight that never quite became true darkness. The moon's thin atmosphere couldn't hold heat, and without a functioning roof, the cabin offered little protection from the biting wind that swept across the plateau. Margaret and Thomas huddled together under a salvaged thermal blanket from their duffel bag, their backs against the one interior wall that seemed structurally sound. Thomas had used the hull plating from the supply boxes to cover the worst of the roof gap, securing it with wire from his toolkit, but cold air still leaked through a dozen cracks and gaps. I can feel every one of my 75 years tonight, Thomas murmured, his breath visible in the chill. Margaret pressed closer to him, sharing warmth. Only 75, I feel at least 90. Despite the discomfort, neither of them had complained. Complaining was pointless. They'd spent the remaining daylight hours doing triage on their situation, and the assessment was grim but not hopeless. The cabin had 4 rooms, or had once. Now it was essentially one large space with partial walls creating the suggestion of separate areas. The main room where they'd settled was the most intact. Beyond it, a smaller chamber had completely collapsed, its ceiling forming a pile of rubble that might contain useful materials if they could excavate it. A third space appeared to have been a storage area, still containing rusted equipment lockers that Thomas planned to investigate at first light. The foundation was solid, at least, poured polymercrete that had been engineered to withstand the moon's seismic activity. Someone had tried to build something permanent here once. The question was why they'd failed. As the temperature continued to drop, Margaret ran through mental calculations. 40 days of food if they rationed strictly. The water reclamator was broken, but Thomas thought he might be able to jury-rig something using parts from the abandoned equipment scattered around the site. Shelter was inadequate but improving. The real problem was long-term sustainability. 40 days would pass quickly. And then what? Tell me what you're thinking, Thomas said quietly. He knew her well enough to hear the gears turning in her mind. I'm thinking about the lichen, Margaret replied. The lichen? On the rocks outside. It's alive, which means there's moisture somewhere, maybe underground. And if there's moisture and these plants can survive, maybe other things can too. She paused. I'm thinking about the garden I kept on Earth before we joined the colony ship. Do you remember it? Thomas chuckled softly. I remember you coaxing tomatoes out of that clay soil behind our house when every neighbor said it was impossible. I remember you talking to those plants like they were children. They responded to attention, Margaret said. Living things do. Even in hostile environments, life finds a way if you give it half a chance. Maggie, this isn't Earth clay. This is a dead moon with barely any atmosphere. That's what the neighbors said about our backyard. She pulled the thermal blanket tighter. I'm not saying it will be easy. I'm saying it's possible. The survey team that built this cabin, they must have had some kind of sustainability plan. Water collection, maybe hydroponics. We need to search more thoroughly tomorrow. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then squeezed her hand. 40 days. So, we'd better work fast. They dozed fitfully through the night, taking turns staying alert in case the cold became dangerous. Margaret found herself thinking about their children, Michael and Sarah, both grown now with families of their own, back on Earth. They'd said goodbye before the colony ship launched, knowing it was likely forever. Faster-than-light travel was possible, but prohibitively expensive. They'd never see their grandchildren grow up, never return home. And now Michael and Sarah would never know what happened to their parents. The Zorath wouldn't send notification of abandonment. The official records would simply list Thomas and Margaret Hayes as mission attrition, natural causes. Margaret pushed the thoughts away. Grief was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. When the twin suns began their ascent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pale yellow, Margaret and Thomas were already awake. They shared a single ration pack for breakfast, a dense, flavorless bar that claimed to contain complete nutrition but tasted like compressed cardboard. Thomas calculated that if they split one pack per day between them, they could stretch their 40 days to 80. They'd be hungry, malnourished eventually, but alive longer. First priority is water, Thomas announced, standing and stretching his stiff joints. Without the reclamator functioning, we have maybe 3 days before dehydration becomes critical. There are some emergency water pouches in the supplies, but they won't last. Margaret nodded. I'll search the cabin for anything useful. Tools, materials, anything the previous occupants left behind. You work on the reclamator and explore the area. There might be a water source nearby. Even ice deposits would help. Thomas picked up his toolkit. Stay within sight of the cabin. I don't know what kind of wildlife exists here, if any. Margaret gave him a dry smile. If there's wildlife, that means there's something to eat. I'll take that as a good sign. They separated, each focused on survival tasks. Margaret began her search in the collapsed storage room, carefully moving debris aside. The previous occupants had left more than she'd initially thought. It was just buried. She found a cracked solar panel, its cells damaged, but possibly repairable. A coil of heavy-duty cable, a manual water pump, rusted but mechanically sound, and most promising, a sealed container that held seeds. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside were dozens of seed packets, their labels faded but still legible. Radiation-resistant wheat, enhanced protein beans, fast-growth potatoes, various vegetables engineered for harsh conditions. This hadn't been a simple survey station. Someone had planned to farm here. "Thomas," she called out, "come look at this." Thomas appeared in the doorway covered in dust from his own excavations. When he saw the seeds, his eyes widened. That's a complete agricultural starter kit, military grade, designed for colony establishment. Why would a survey team have this? They wouldn't. Thomas picked up one of the packets, examining it. This was a colony attempt, a failed one by the looks of it, but they had serious infrastructure plans. He pointed to markings on the container. See this? Zorath Imperial Agriculture Division. This moon was designated for colonization at some point. So what happened? Why did they abandon it? Thomas looked around the cabin with new eyes. I don't know. But if they brought agriculture supplies, they must have solved the water problem. We need to search more carefully. They spent the next several hours combing through every corner of the cabin and the immediate surrounding area. Thomas found a hand-drawn map tucked into a crack in the wall, barely legible, but showing the layout of the original facility. According to the map, there was a well system approximately 200 meters west of the cabin and an underground storage bunker to the north. Underground means protected from temperature extremes, Margaret noted. There might be preserved supplies in that bunker. They set out west first, following compass bearings since the map's landmarks had long since eroded. The terrain was rocky and uneven, challenging for their aging bodies, but they moved carefully, conserving energy. Margaret's knees protested every step, but she gritted her teeth and kept going. They found the well after 40 minutes of searching. It was marked by a circular stone structure, partially buried by accumulated dust and debris. Thomas cleared away the covering and peered down into darkness. "Hand me the light," he said. Margaret passed him the small emergency torch from their supplies. Thomas shone it down the well shaft. The beam reflected off something wet about 10 meters down. "Water," he breathed. "There's water." Margaret felt something release in her chest, tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Water meant time. Water meant possibility. Thomas tested the manual pump they'd found in the cabin, attaching it to the well's ancient coupling. The mechanism was stiff, the seals dry and cracked, but after several minutes of effort and some improvised repairs using medical tape from Margaret's kit, water began to flow. It came out rust-colored at first, then gradually cleared to a pale amber. "We'll need to filter and boil it," Margaret said, "but this is drinkable. This changes everything." They filled every container they had, then made their way back to the cabin, their loads heavy but their spirits lighter. On the return journey, Margaret noticed something she'd missed before: patterns in the dust near the well, lines too regular to be natural erosion. "Thomas, look at this." He crouched beside her, examining the ground. Irrigation channels, buried, but still here. There was a whole farming complex around this well at some point. Can we restore it? Maybe. If the channels aren't too badly damaged, and if we can get water flowing through them again, so he trailed off, calculating. It would take weeks. We'd need to excavate, repair leaks, probably rebuild entire sections. And that's assuming the soil composition will support plant growth at all. We have seeds engineered for harsh conditions, Margaret countered. And we have time, 80 days if we ration carefully. Maybe more if we can supplement with foraged food. Thomas looked at her, then at the barren landscape around them. You really think we can do this, turn this dead rock into a farm? I think the alternative is sitting in that cabin waiting to starve. Margaret hefted her water container. And I didn't raise 2 children and survive 40 years in colonial medicine to give up because something's difficult. A slow smile spread across Thomas's weathered face. When you put it that way. They made it back to the cabin as the suns reached their zenith, the heat now oppressive after the morning chill. They spent the afternoon organizing their resources, creating an inventory of everything they had versus everything they needed. The list of needs was long, but the list of assets was growing. By evening, they'd established a routine. Boil water, ration food, repair one thing, plan the next day's work. It wasn't much, but it was structure, and structure gave purpose. As darkness fell again and the temperature plummeted, they sat together on the cabin floor, the thermal blanket around their shoulders. Thomas had managed to patch more of the roof, so the wind wasn't quite as harsh. Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder. Day 2, she said softly. Day 2, Thomas echoed. 78 to go. We found water. We found seeds. We found a map. Margaret's voice carried quiet determination. Tomorrow we find the bunker, and the day after that we start planting. It's going to be hard work. It always has been. Outside, the moon's surface stretched away into shadow, hostile and indifferent. But inside the slowly improving cabin, 2 people who had been abandoned as worthless were proving that value couldn't be calculated in spreadsheets. It was measured in resilience, in skill accumulated over decades, in the refusal to accept defeat. The Zorath had given them 40 days to die with dignity. Margaret and Thomas were going to use those 40 days to build something that would outlast them both. And on the second night on LK-247, with frost forming on the rocks outside and stars burning cold overhead, they slept a little easier, knowing that tomorrow they would continue the work of transforming abandonment into something that looked just barely like hope. Day 3 dawned with a phenomenon neither Margaret nor Thomas had anticipated: frost. Delicate crystalline patterns covered the rocks around the cabin, sparkling in the early morning light like scattered diamonds. Margaret touched one of the formations gently, watching it melt against her fingertip. Ice, she murmured. There's more water in the atmosphere than we thought. Thomas emerged from the cabin carrying the repaired solar panel he'd been working on by lamplight. His back ached from sleeping on the hard floor, but his eyes were alert. If there's frost, we can collect it. Might supplement our well water. They spent an hour setting up collection tarps using the polymer sheeting they'd salvaged, angling them to catch the frost melt as the temperature rose. It wasn't much, perhaps a liter in total, but every bit helped. Margaret carefully transferred the water into their cleaned containers, already thinking about how to build a more efficient system. After their meager breakfast, another half-ration bar split between them, they prepared for the journey north to find the underground bunker. According to the faded map, it was approximately half a kilometer from the cabin, marked by a red X and the notation Primary Storage Environmental Seal. Environmental seal is good, Thomas said, checking his toolkit. Means whatever's inside should be preserved, protected from the elements. If the seal hasn't failed, Margaret pointed out, ever the pragmatist. She packed her medical kit, some water and the emergency torch. And if whoever abandoned this place didn't strip it clean before they left. The trek north was more challenging than their previous journey to the well. The terrain grew increasingly rocky, with loose scree that shifted treacherously underfoot. Margaret's breathing became labored in the thin air, and they had to stop several times to rest. Thomas watched her with concern, but she waved him off. I'm 73, not dead, she said firmly. Just give me a moment. They found the bunker entrance almost by accident. It was camouflaged beneath a collapsed overhang, barely visible until they were nearly on top of it. A heavy metal hatch, partially buried in accumulated debris, marked with Zorath construction codes. Thomas cleared away the covering material, while Margaret caught her breath. The hatch wheel was locked with a mechanical combination system. Its numbers faded but still visible. Thomas studied it, then pulled out the map again, examining the margins where someone had scribbled notations. Here, he said, pointing to a series of numbers. Could be the combination, or could be coordinates, only one way to find out. He entered the sequence. 7, 22, 4, 18. The wheel resisted at first, then suddenly gave way with a metallic groan that echoed across the plateau. Thomas strained against it, his muscles trembling with effort, and finally the hatch swung open, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. Cold air rushed up from below, carrying the scent of metal and something else, something organic, like old earth. "I'll go first," Thomas said, pulling out the torch. "Like hell you will." Margaret was already swinging her legs over the edge. "You're the engineer. If something down there needs fixing, I need you alive, not broken at the bottom of a ladder because your 75-year-old joints gave out halfway down. I'm lighter. I go first." Thomas wanted to argue, but recognized the logic. "Careful, Maggie. Test each rung before you put your weight on it." The descent took several minutes. The ladder was solid, which spoke well of the bunker's construction, but Margaret's hands were shaking by the time she reached the bottom. The torch beam played across a small antechamber, with a sealed door bearing hazard warnings in 3 languages: Zorath, Krelian, and surprisingly, English. "Caution. Biological materials. Maintain seal integrity." "Thomas," Margaret called up, "there's a door. It says biological materials. Can you open it?" She examined the mechanism. It was an airlock system, manual but well designed. There was a pressure gauge on the wall showing equalized atmosphere on both sides. She cranked the wheel, and after a moment of resistance, the inner door unsealed with a soft hiss. What lay beyond made Margaret stop breathing. The bunker was enormous, at least 30 meters across, carved deep into the moon's bedrock, and it was full of life. Row upon row of hydroponic tables stretched into the darkness, each one containing plants in various stages of growth. Not thriving plants, but not dead either. They'd gone dormant, adapted to the low light and minimal care, but they were alive. Tomatoes hung from wilted vines. Potatoes had gone to seed in their containers. Leafy greens had bolted and spread in wild, tangled masses. The air was humid, almost earth-like, maintained by some still-functioning environmental system. "Oh my God," Margaret whispered. Thomas descended the ladder and came up behind her, and she heard him make a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Someone grew a farm," he said in wonder. "They grew a whole farm underground." They moved through the bunker carefully, their torch beam revealing more marvels. Water tanks along one wall, fed by an underground spring that trickled continuously. That was the moisture source for the frost above. Solar batteries still holding a faint charge, connected to the small panel they'd seen above ground. Grow lights, most burned out, but some still glowing dimly. And in the back corner, sealed containers stacked floor to ceiling. Margaret opened the first container with trembling hands. Inside were more seeds, these ones fresh, vacuum-sealed, dozens of varieties. A complete agricultural library. The second container held tools, hand cultivators, irrigation fittings, soil testing equipment. The third contained nutrient solutions, still good, designed to last decades. "This was meant to sustain a permanent colony," Thomas said, pulling out a datapad from one of the containers. Its screen flickered to life, barely charged, but functional. He scrolled through the files, his expression growing somber. "Mission logs. Looks like a Zorath agricultural research team was here 15 years ago, testing crop viability for colonial expansion. What happened to them?" Thomas continued reading, his face illuminated by the pale blue screen. "Imperial recall. The project was deemed inefficient resource allocation. They were ordered to abandon the facility with minimal notice." He paused. "There's a personal note here from the team leader. We begged them to let us complete the work. 3 more months and we could have proven the viability of lunar farming in low-atmosphere environments. But Command only sees numbers, not potential. We sealed the bunker in hopes that someone might continue what we started." Margaret felt a surge of emotion, anger at the waste, gratitude for the gift they'd been left, sorrow for scientists who'd had their life's work dismissed by bureaucrats who couldn't see beyond quarterly reports. "They left all this," she said softly, "everything they'd built, hoping someone would use it. And we will." Thomas set down the datapad and looked at Margaret. "This changes everything. We have seeds, we have nutrients, we have working hydroponics. We even have some plants already started. We can harvest what's here, propagate the healthy ones, start new growth." Margaret walked among the dormant tables, touching leaves gently. She'd spent 40 years as a medic, but before that, before children and colonial service, she'd studied botany. She'd dreamed of being a farmer, of working with living things that grew and changed and responded to care. Life had taken her down a different path, but the knowledge was still there, waiting. "These tomatoes are salvageable," she said, examining a vine. "They've gone mostly to seed, but the root structure is healthy. We can take cuttings, propagate new plants." She moved to the next table. "The potatoes, too. And this," she touched a sprawling green plant. "This is an enhanced protein bean variety. Wild now, but we can harvest the seeds and cultivate properly." "How long?" Thomas asked. "Until we have actual food production." Margaret did mental calculations, factoring in growth rates, their current resources, the moon's limited sunlight. "Potatoes, maybe 40 days if we're lucky, and the growth cycle accelerates with proper care. The fast-growth varieties might give us edible greens in 2 weeks. Beans, 2 months minimum." She looked at him. "We'll run out of rations before anything matures. Then we'll have to stretch further. 1 ration bar between us every 2 days instead of every day. Supplement with whatever we can harvest from what's already growing here." "That's starvation rations, Thomas." "It's survival rations," he corrected. "There's a difference." They spent the rest of the day cataloguing the bunker's contents and carefully harvesting what they could from the established plants. Margaret found ripe tomatoes hidden beneath withered leaves, small, misshapen, but real food. She nearly cried when she bit into one. The burst of flavor after days of bland ration bars almost overwhelming. They filled a container with everything they could carry. Tomatoes, some edible greens that had somehow survived, seed pods from the beans, and young potato plants carefully extracted with their root balls intact. Thomas loaded up with tools, nutrient solutions, and the most critical parts of the hydroponic system that they might be able to adapt for surface use. As they prepared to leave, Margaret noticed something she'd missed before, a small memorial plaque mounted on the wall near the entrance. She shone her torch on it, reading the inscription, "In memory of Dr. Kelsin Talveris, agricultural specialist, Imperial Research Division. He believed that feeding people was the highest calling. He believed every world deserved a chance to bloom. May someone carry on his work." "Thomas," Margaret called softly, "come look at this." He read the plaque in silence, then placed his hand on it briefly. "We will," he said to the memory of Dr. Talveris. "We'll carry it on." The climb back up the ladder was harder than the descent, their arms loaded with supplies, their bodies exhausted. By the time they emerged into the late afternoon light, both of them were shaking with fatigue. But they'd made it, and they had food, real food, not just ration bars. The journey back to the cabin took twice as long as the trip out, but they moved carefully, protecting their precious cargo. The sun's amber light painted everything in warm tones, and for the first time since their abandonment, the moon didn't look quite so hostile. That night they had a feast, fresh tomatoes sliced and shared, bitter greens that tasted like hope. It wasn't much, barely enough to constitute a side dish by Earth standards, but after days of compressed ration bars, it was magnificent. "Tomorrow we start planting," Margaret said, savoring the last bite of tomato. "We'll use the irrigation channels near the well, get water flowing to create proper growing beds. The soil here is mineral-rich but nutrient-poor. We'll need to amend it with the solutions from the bunker. I can rig up a solar array using the panels we found," Thomas added. "Extend power down to the bunker so we can get more of those grow lights operational. We'll need to make regular trips to maintain the underground garden, but if we can get both locations producing, we might actually make it." Thomas reached across and took her hand. "We will make it." Outside, the temperature dropped, and frost began to form again on the rocks. But inside the cabin, warmed by their small lamp and the knowledge that they had resources, skills, and most importantly, a real plan, Margaret and Thomas felt something they hadn't felt since the Zorath had abandoned them. They felt like farmers, like colonists, like people building a future rather than counting down to an ending. The bunker had been a gift from a scientist who died believing his work mattered, left for whoever might come after. And now 2 elderly humans, discarded as worthless by an empire that calculated value in decimals and percentages, would prove that the most important resources couldn't be quantified. Knowledge, determination, the stubborn human refusal to give up. And perhaps most dangerous of all to those who'd underestimated them, time. Time to work, time to grow, time to transform abandonment into something the Zorath could never have predicted. On the 3rd night, Margaret fell asleep thinking of seeds taking root, of green things pushing up through alien soil, of life finding its way in impossible places, the way it always had, the way it always would. Week 2 on LK-247 began with back-breaking labor. Margaret woke before the suns rose, her joints stiff and protesting, but her mind already running through the day's tasks. Beside her, Thomas was already awake, staring at the patched ceiling, his calloused hands flexing slowly to work out the night's stiffness. "My body is reminding me I'm not 40 anymore," he said with a dry chuckle. "Mine's reminding me I'm not 60, Margaret replied, sitting up slowly. "But we don't have the luxury of listening to it." They'd spent the previous 4 days establishing their farming operation with methodical precision. The irrigation channels near the well had been excavated and repaired, a task that left both of them sunburned, despite the weak sunlight, their hands blistered, their backs screaming in protest. But water now flowed, where it hadn't flowed in 15 years, trickling along the ancient pathways, darkening the dusty soil. Margaret had created growing beds, using a combination of the native mineral soil and nutrient amendments from the bunker. She'd tested and retested the pH levels, adjusted compositions, added organic matter from the composted plant waste they'd cleared from the underground facility. It wasn't perfect. Nothing about this situation was perfect, but it was workable. Thomas had engineered a solar power system that would have made his former colleagues weep with its elegant simplicity. Using the panels they'd salvaged, some wire, and components cannibalized from broken equipment, he'd created a network that charged batteries during the day and powered essential systems at night. The bunker's grow lights now operated on a regular cycle. The water pump at the well ran smoothly. They even had lighting in the cabin, dim but enough to work by after dark. On day 8, they planted their first crop. Margaret knelt in the prepared soil, her knees cushioned by a folded piece of polymer sheeting, and made careful holes with a hand cultivator. Into each hole went a potato segment, carefully selected from the healthiest plants in the bunker, each one containing at least 2 eyes that would sprout new growth. She covered them gently, patted the soil, whispered encouragement the way she had to her earth garden decades ago. "Potatoes talk back?" Thomas asked, amused as he worked the row beside her. "Everything talks if you listen," Margaret replied. "Plants respond to care and attention. There are studies—" I know," Thomas smiled. "You've been telling me about the studies for 50 years, and your garden on Earth was the best in the neighborhood, so I'm not arguing." They planted in sections, diversifying their crops for resilience. Fast-growth greens in one bed, these would mature quickest, providing food within weeks. Protein-enhanced beans in another, their nitrogen-fixing roots improving soil quality even as they grew. The radiation-resistant wheat in a third section, a longer-term investment but crucial for eventual sustainability. And everywhere the potatoes, which would become their staple. The work was exhausting. By midday, when the twin suns reached their peak and the temperature soared into uncomfortable ranges, both Margaret and Thomas were drenched in sweat, their movements slowed by fatigue. But they didn't stop, couldn't stop. Every seed planted was a bet against starvation, and the odds only improved with each additional crop. During their brief lunch break, a quarter ration bar and some recycled greens from the bunker harvest, Margaret surveyed their work with quiet satisfaction. 60% of the available growing space planted, she said. "If we maintain this pace, we'll have full coverage by day 12. "And then the waiting begins," Thomas said, drinking carefully rationed water. "The hardest part. You've never been good at waiting. Neither have you. We're well matched that way." He looked at her, his weathered face serious. "How are our supplies holding up?" Margaret had been tracking their consumption with the precision of a field medic managing medical supplies in a combat zone. "We have 19 ration bars left. At our current intake, 1 bar every 2 days. That's 38 days. The bunker greens have added maybe a week, so we're looking at 45 days total before we're completely dependent on what we've planted. The fast greens should start producing in 14 days, Thomas calculated. That leaves a 31-day gap, which means we need to cut rations further or find supplemental food sources." Margaret glanced around the plateau. "I've been thinking about the lichen. It's photosynthetic, which means it contains some nutritional value. Might be edible, might also be poisonous. That's what test subjects are for." She saw his expression. "Relax. I'll test it properly. Skin contact first, then a tiny amount, monitoring for reactions. Standard survival protocol." "I'm a medic, remember." Thomas wanted to protest, but the mathematics of starvation were undeniable. They needed to consider every option. "Be careful. Always am." The afternoon brought an unexpected challenge. As they worked on expanding the irrigation system, Thomas's excavation uncovered something that made him stop abruptly. "Maggie, come here." She crossed to where he stood, looking down at what he'd unearthed. Bones. Not human, not Zorath, but something else. A skeletal structure roughly 2 meters long, with a skull that featured forward-facing eye sockets and sharp teeth. A predator of some kind. "So there is wildlife here," Margaret said quietly. Or was. Thomas carefully examined the remains without disturbing them. These bones are old. Decades, maybe. And they're inside what was clearly a cultivated area. This thing died here, probably during the original colony attempt. Cause of death? Can't tell without more examination. No obvious trauma. Thomas looked around uneasily. Question is, are there more of them? And are they still alive? That possibility cast a shadow over the rest of the day's work. They'd been so focused on water, food, and shelter that the threat of dangerous wildlife hadn't been a primary concern. Now they had to reconsider everything. They worked faster, less carelessly, watching the rocks for movement. But nothing appeared. As the suns began their descent and the temperature dropped, the plateau remained still and silent, except for the whisper of wind and the trickle of water through their repaired channels. That evening, Margaret conducted her lichen test with methodical care. She crushed a small sample of the pale growth she'd scraped from a nearby rock, rubbed it on her inner forearm, and waited. No reaction after 30 minutes. She touched a tiny amount to her lips. Bitter, but no burning or numbness. Finally, she consumed a piece the size of her thumbnail and settled in to monitor her body's response. Thomas watched with concern, but Margaret remained clinical, taking her own pulse, checking her temperature with a hand on her forehead, paying attention to any signs of nausea or distress. 2 hours later, she declared the test successful. "It's edible, not pleasant, tastes like bitter dust, but it's not toxic. We can supplement with it if necessary." "You're terrifying when you're determined, you know that." "I prefer the term resourceful." Margaret allowed herself a small smile. "Besides, you married me knowing full well what you were getting into." "That I did." On day 10, their routine was established. Wake at dawn, collect frost melt, check the growing beds, make the trek to the bunker to maintain the underground hydroponics and harvest any ready greens, repair and improve their infrastructure, plant more seeds, ration food carefully, sleep and repeat. It was grueling work for people their age, but it was also purposeful. Each day brought visible progress. The irrigation channels now covered a 1/4 kilometer, creating a network of dark, damp soil where before there'd been only dust. The first tiny green shoots emerged from the fast-growth beds, fragile but undeniably alive. The cabin's roof was now completely sealed. The solar array expanded daily as Thomas salvaged and repaired more panels. Margaret kept a journal using paper from the bunker and a pen she'd had in her medical kit. Each evening she documented what they'd planted, the weather conditions, problems encountered, solutions implemented. It was partly practical record-keeping, partly a way to maintain hope by seeing their progress written down. Day 10, she wrote by lamplight. First sprouts visible in beds 1 to 3. Potato beds remain dormant, but this is expected. Thomas completed solar array expansion. We now have 40% more power capacity. My hands have more blisters than skin, and I've discovered muscles I'd forgotten I had, but we're going to make it. I can feel it. Day 12 brought an unexpected gift. Margaret woke to find the growing beds covered in a thin layer of dew, more moisture than they'd seen from frost collection. The atmospheric humidity was increasing, possibly triggered by their own irrigation efforts. More water meant better plant growth, meant a positive feedback loop. "Look at this," she said, showing Thomas the water droplets collected on the leaves of their sprouts. "The ecosystem is responding to what we're doing. We're not just growing plants, we're changing the local environment." Thomas examined the phenomenon with an engineer's interest. Increased surface water leads to more evaporation, which increases atmospheric moisture, which leads to more condensation and precipitation. If we can sustain this, we might create a microclimate around the growing area, a green zone on a dead moon. Margaret laughed softly. Wouldn't that be something? By day 14, the first fast-growth greens were ready for harvest. Margaret cut them carefully, her hands trembling slightly with anticipation. They weren't large, the leaves were small and tough, but they were food. Real, nutritious, homegrown food. That night's dinner was a celebration. Fresh greens, the last of their hoarded tomatoes from the bunker, and a 1/4 ration bar split between them. It was barely enough to fill their stomachs, but it was a triumph. "First successful harvest on LK-247, Thomas said, raising his water cup in a toast. "To the farmers. To the farmer who believed this was possible," Margaret corrected, clinking her cup against his, and to the engineer who made it work. As they ate, Margaret noticed that Thomas was moving more slowly than usual, favoring his right side. "Your back?" she asked. "It's fine." "Thomas," he sighed. "It's my back. Pulled something yesterday moving those rocks. Nothing serious." Margaret shifted into medic mode immediately. "Let me see." She examined him carefully, her fingers probing the tight muscles along his spine. There was inflammation, strain, but nothing that suggested serious injury. She applied the last of their medical ointment and fashioned a support wrap from spare cloth. "You need to be more careful," she said firmly. "We can't afford injuries. I'm serious, Thomas. You're not young anymore, and neither am I. We have to work smart, not just hard." "Yes, doctor." But his tone was affectionate, not dismissive. "I'll be more careful, promise." That night, as they lay under their thermal blanket listening to the wind outside their now weatherproof cabin, Margaret thought about how far they'd come. 2 weeks ago they'd been abandoned to die. Now they had shelter, water, power, and growing food. They'd turned a death sentence into a farming operation. But she also knew the next phase would be critical. Their ration bars were dwindling. The crops needed time to mature. There would be hungry days ahead, possibly dangerous ones. They'd have to be smart, careful, resilient. "Are you scared?" Thomas asked quietly in the darkness. Margaret considered the question honestly. "Sometimes, but I'm also—" She searched for the word, "exhilarated." "We're doing something impossible. Every day we survive is proof that those Zorath bureaucrats were wrong about us, that we're not used up, not worthless." "Revenge farming," Thomas said with a chuckle. "I like it." "It's not revenge. It's—" Margaret thought about Dr. Talvaris and his abandoned research, about the careful way he'd sealed the bunker, hoping someone would continue his work. "It's carrying on. It's refusing to let good work die just because someone in power couldn't see its value." Outside, the wind carried new scents, the faint smell of disturbed soil, of growing things, of water evaporating and condensing. The moon was changing because they were changing it, not quickly, not easily, but undeniably. And in the growing beds around the cabin, beneath soil that had been dead for decades, seeds were sprouting, roots were spreading, and life was returning to a place that had forgotten what life looked like. On day 14, Margaret and Thomas fell asleep as they had for the past 2 weeks, exhausted, hungry, but not without hope. The garden was taking root, and so were they. Day 23 arrived with a crisis Margaret had been dreading. They were down to their last 3 ration bars, and the main potato crop wouldn't be ready for harvest for at least another 2 weeks. The fast-growth greens provided nutrients, but not enough calories to sustain heavy labor. They were slowly starving, and both of them knew it. Margaret had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Her clothes hung loose, her face had become gaunt, and her hands trembled slightly when she worked. Thomas was in worse shape. His injury had healed, but the caloric deficit was taking a toll on a body that needed fuel to repair itself. He moved more slowly each day, his strength visibly diminishing. "We need to talk about rationing," Margaret said one morning as they shared their dawn meal, a handful of bitter greens and lichen paste. "If we split the last 3 bars over 6 days, that's half a bar every 2 days, plus whatever we can harvest." "That's not enough to sustain agricultural work," Thomas said bluntly. "We'll be too weak to maintain the gardens, and if we can't maintain them, the crops will fail. We're in a catch-22. Margaret had been thinking about this problem for days. "Then we reduce the work, focus only on essential maintenance, and we sleep more, conserve energy. Our bodies will adapt to the reduced intake. For a while, maybe. But Maggie, we're not kids. Starvation affects elderly people differently. Our bodies don't have the same resilience." Thomas's voice was gentle but honest. "I'm not trying to be pessimistic, I'm trying to be realistic." "I know." Margaret reached across and took his hand. His skin was paper-thin, the bones prominent beneath. When had his hands become so frail? "But we're so close, the potatoes are developing tubers. I checked yesterday, the beans are flowering. 2 more weeks, maybe 3, and we'll have substantial food production. We just have to hold on." Then we hold on. That day they implemented their new protocol. Minimal work, checking water systems, light weeding, harvesting the few greens that had matured. The rest of the time, they stayed in the cabin, conserving energy, sleeping when possible. It was maddening to lie still when there was work to be done, but the alternative was collapse. On day 25, Margaret made a discovery that shifted everything. She was conducting her morning inspection of the growing beds when she noticed unusual tracks in the soft soil near the irrigation channel. Not human tracks. Something with 4 legs, clawed feet, and a tail that dragged behind it. Her heart raced. The predator bones they'd found. Perhaps the species wasn't extinct after all. She followed the tracks carefully, her medical training making her observant of details. The creature had come to the water channel to drink, then moved off toward the rocky outcroppings to the east. It hadn't approached the cabin, hadn't disturbed the plants. Whatever it was, it seemed to be avoiding them. Margaret returned to the cabin where Thomas was resting, his breathing labored from simple exhaustion. She told him about the tracks. "How big?" he asked, immediately alert despite his fatigue. "Maybe 50 kilos, based on pore size and depth of impression. Not huge, but not small either." Margaret pulled out her journal and sketched what she'd seen. Claws suggest a digger or possibly a climber. The tail drag indicates a long, heavy tail for balance. Predator or prey? Could be either, or both. Something in the middle of the food chain, Margaret thought carefully. The important question is whether it's a threat to us, and whether it's a potential food source. Thomas looked at her sharply. "You're considering hunting it. I'm considering options. If there's wildlife here, that means there's a food web we haven't discovered yet. Where there's one animal, there are others. Maybe some we can trap or catch." She saw his expression. "I know how it sounds. I'm a medic, not a hunter, but people have survived on less in worse situations. With what weapon? We have a wrench and a hand cultivator. We have wire from the salvage. We can make snares. And I have my medical scalpel. It's sharp enough to process anything we catch." Margaret's voice was steady, but inside she felt the weight of what she was proposing. Taking a life, even an animal's life, wasn't something she'd ever done before. But watching Thomas waste away, feeling her own body consuming itself for fuel, that was worse. They spent the afternoon fashioning simple snares from wire, setting them near the water channel where the tracks had been. It was a long shot and they both knew it. But doing something, anything, was better than passively waiting to starve. Day 27 brought both triumph and sorrow. Margaret woke to find something struggling in one of their snares, a creature about the size of a large rabbit, with 6 legs, scaled skin, and a long prehensile tail. It had been caught while drinking from the irrigation channel, and by the time Margaret reached it, it was already dead from stress and exhaustion. She knelt beside it, feeling an unexpected wave of grief. This small creature had been living on this harsh moon, surviving against odds almost as impossible as their own, and now it was dead because they needed to eat. "I'm sorry," she whispered, touching its still warm scales, "but thank you." Processing the creature was difficult work that made Margaret grateful for her medical training. The anatomy was alien but recognizable. Muscles, organs, bone structure. She worked quickly, efficiently, separating edible meat from waste using every part she could. The result was perhaps 1/2 kilo of protein. Not much, but precious. That night, they cooked the meat over a small fire Thomas built using dried plant material and a salvaged igniter. The smell was strange, not quite like any earth animal, but Margaret's mouth watered despite the alienness of it. They ate slowly, savoring every bite, their bodies responding to the protein with almost desperate gratitude. "It's good," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. "God, Maggie, it's so good." "It's survival," Margaret chewed carefully, making it last. "And it buys us time." Over the next week they caught 2 more of the creatures, which Margaret had started calling scalars because of their scaled skin. The protein helped, kept them from complete collapse, but it wasn't enough. They were still losing weight, still weakening. Every task required exponentially more effort than it should have. On day 32, Thomas collapsed while checking the potato beds. Margaret heard the thud and rushed out to find him on the ground, conscious but unable to stand. His skin was cold and clammy, his pulse rapid and weak. Hypoglycemia combined with exhaustion. She'd seen it before in famine situations. "I'm okay," he insisted, but his voice was barely a whisper. "You're not okay. Neither of us is." Margaret helped him back to the cabin, her own legs shaking with the effort. Once he was settled, she conducted a proper medical assessment. Low blood pressure, signs of muscle wasting, skin that had lost elasticity, all indicators of advanced malnutrition. They were in real danger now. Not hypothetical future danger, but immediate crisis. If they didn't get substantial calories soon, one or both of them would suffer organ failure. And without proper medical equipment, there would be nothing Margaret could do to save them. That night was the hardest. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness while Margaret kept watch, monitoring his breathing, trying not to think about what would happen if she lost him. Not just the loss of her partner, her best friend, the man she'd loved for over 50 years, but the practical reality that she couldn't maintain the garden alone. His engineering skills were essential. They were a team, and if half the team failed, "Don't you dare give up on me," she whispered to his sleeping form. "We've come too far. We're too close." Day 34 brought a small miracle. Margaret checked the potato bed with trembling hands and found that the plants were ready, not ideally mature but harvestable. The tubers were small, not fully developed, but they were there. Food, real, substantial food. She dug carefully, not wanting to damage the precious harvest. The first potato she pulled from the earth was barely larger than her thumb, but she held it like it was made of gold. More followed, dozens of small tubers, some barely worth eating, others a decent size. By the time she'd harvested one section of the bed, she had perhaps 3 kilos of potatoes. Margaret wept as she carried them back to the cabin. Actual tears, something she'd been too dehydrated to produce for days. But these weren't tears of despair. They were tears of relief so overwhelming it felt like a physical force. She cooked the potatoes immediately, boiling them in precious water until they were soft. The smell filled the cabin, earthy and perfect. She woke Thomas gently. "We made it," she said, helping him sit up. "The potatoes are ready. We have food, Thomas. Real food." He looked at the bowl she offered him with confusion at first, then understanding, then emotion that mirrored her own. He took a small potato and bit into it, and Margaret watched his face transform, color returning, life returning. They ate slowly, their shrunken stomachs protesting the sudden influx of food, but neither of them could stop. After weeks of hunger, of lichen paste and bitter greens and occasional scraps of scala meat, the potatoes tasted like the finest meal ever prepared. "We did it," Thomas said when he'd finished. His voice was stronger already, just from the single meal. "We actually did it. We grew food on a dead moon." "We did." Margaret leaned against him, exhausted but triumphant. "And there's more. The beans are almost ready. The wheat is growing strong. The underground hydroponics are producing more greens every day. We're going to make it, Thomas. We're really going to make it." Day 36 marked a turning point. With regular potato meals, still small portions, still carefully rationed but consistent, both Margaret and Thomas began to regain strength. Thomas could work for short periods without collapsing. Margaret's hands stopped trembling. The worst of the crisis had passed. They expanded their harvest carefully, taking from different beds to avoid depleting any single area, always leaving enough seed potatoes to plant again. Margaret calculated that if they were careful, if they rotated crops and managed their resources properly, they could sustain themselves indefinitely. The garden had saved them. The abandoned research of Dr. Talveris, combined with 2 humans who refused to give up, had transformed a death sentence into a functioning agricultural ecosystem. On the evening of day 38, as they sat outside the cabin watching the twin suns set over their growing fields, Margaret noticed something that made her smile. The area around their irrigation channels had taken on a slightly different color, not quite green but no longer the uniform gray of dead stone. Life was spreading, tiny organisms responding to the presence of water and organic matter, beginning the slow process of creating actual soil. "Look at that," she said, pointing. "We're not just growing food, we're growing a biosphere." Thomas followed her gaze and nodded slowly. 40 days. That's how long they said our supplies would last. It's been 38. And we're still here, still working, still alive. Margaret reached for his hand. Commander Velcaris calculated our survival probability and found it insufficient. But he didn't account for one thing. What's that? Human stubbornness. She squeezed his hand. The refusal to accept someone else's calculations about our worth. The willingness to work until our hands bleed and our backs break because we believe we deserve to survive. "Revenge farming," Thomas said again, and this time they both laughed, the sound carrying across the plateau, startling a small scala that had crept near the water channel. The hungry month was ending. They'd survived the worst of it through skill, determination, luck, and the legacy of a Zorath scientist who'd believed that feeding people mattered more than quarterly efficiency reports. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, as the temperature dropped and frost began to form on the rocks, Margaret and Thomas sat together in front of their cabin, not a ruin anymore, but a home, and watched their garden grow in the gathering darkness. They'd been abandoned to die. Instead, they'd learned to live, and that made all the difference. 3 months after their abandonment, LK-247 had transformed into something neither Margaret nor Thomas would have believed possible. The plateau that had once been nothing but dust and rock now bloomed with ordered rows of green, potato plants spreading their broad leaves, bean vines climbing improvised trellises, wheat swaying gently in the thin breeze. The irrigation channels no longer just carried water, they supported entire miniature ecosystems of moss and lichen that helped retain moisture and enrich the soil. Margaret stood at the edge of their garden on a morning in what she decided to call late spring, though the moon had no true seasons. She'd gained back the weight she'd lost and then some. Her cheeks had color again, her arms had regained their strength. At 73, she felt more capable than she had in years. Hard work, purpose, and good food had a way of restoring vitality that no medical treatment could match. "The wheat's ready," Thomas called from the far end of the field. He walked toward her with a steady gait, his back straight again, his grey beard neatly trimmed and streaked with white. In his hands he carried several stalks heavy with grain. "We'll need to harvest today before the suns get too high." They developed an intuition about the weather patterns on LK-247, learning to read the color of the sky, the behavior of the wind, the formation of frost. It was a harsh environment, but no longer a hostile one. They'd learned its rhythms, adapted to its demands, and in turn shaped it to support life. The cabin was no longer recognizable as the ruin they'd first entered. Thomas had repaired every wall, sealed every crack, and even added a second room by salvaging materials from the collapsed structures scattered around the area. They had a proper kitchen area now, with shelves Thomas had built from scavenged metal, storage containers for their harvest, and a functioning stove fashioned from parts of the old solar batteries and heating elements. Margaret had created a small herb garden inside one of the windows, basil, thyme, and hardy sage from seeds found in the bunker, filling the space with fragrance. Outside, a small shelter housed their expanding collection of tools, seeds for the next planting, and preserved food stores. They'd learned to dry potatoes into chips that would last months, to ferment beans into a protein-rich paste, to process wheat into rough flour that made something approaching bread. It wasn't gourmet cooking, but it was varied, nutritious, and entirely their own production. "We should celebrate," Margaret said, as they began harvesting wheat. The work was meditative, rhythmic, cutting stalks, bundling them, laying them out to dry. 3 months of survival, 90 days of proving them wrong. "Every day we wake up is a celebration," Thomas replied, but he was smiling. "Though I suppose we could make something special. We have enough flour now." "Real bread?" "Real bread," Margaret agreed. "And maybe some of that bean wine you've been experimenting with." Thomas laughed. "I'm not sure wine is the right word for fermented bean juice, but it's definitely alcoholic, so close enough." They worked through the morning, their movements efficient from months of practice. The labor was still hard, but their bodies had adapted, become stronger. Margaret's hands, once soft from decades of medical work, were now calloused and capable. Thomas moved like a man 20 years younger, his engineer's mind constantly finding ways to make their work easier, more efficient. By midday, they'd harvested enough wheat for several weeks of bread. Margaret began processing it, while Thomas checked on their latest project, a small greenhouse constructed from salvaged polymer panels and metal framing. Inside, they were experimenting with crops that needed more controlled conditions, delicate herbs, tomato varieties that couldn't handle the temperature swings, even some flowering plants Margaret had found seeds for. "The tomatoes are setting fruit," Thomas reported, returning from his inspection. "Another week and we'll have fresh tomatoes again, the real kind, not the half-wild ones from the bunker." Margaret looked up from grinding wheat with a hand-cranked mill they'd assembled from spare parts. "I've been thinking about expansion." "Of course you have." Thomas sat down beside her, taking over the grinding to give her arms a rest. "What kind of expansion?" "The area to the south where the ground is more sheltered. I think we could establish a second growing zone there. It would mean more work, more irrigation to build, but it would also mean redundancy. If something goes wrong in one area, disease, pests, whatever, we'd have a backup." Thomas considered this while grinding. "Makes sense from an engineering standpoint. Distributed systems are more resilient than centralized ones, but it would take weeks to set up." "We have time now," Margaret said. "That's the miracle, isn't it? We bought ourselves time. Every successful harvest gives us more breathing room to plan, to improve, to build for the long term." They spent the afternoon making bread, a process that felt almost ceremonial. Margaret mixed the flour with water, and a sourdough starter she'd been carefully cultivating, kneaded the dough with practiced hands, and shaped it into loaves. They baked them in their improvised oven, and the smell that filled the cabin was pure heaven, yeast and grain and warmth. When the bread was ready, they sat outside at a small table Thomas had built, watching the suns descend toward the horizon. The bread was dense and slightly bitter compared to earth wheat, but it was real bread. Margaret spread some of their precious butter, rendered from the fat of scallows they'd caught, and took a bite. It was good. Better than good. It was proof of everything they'd accomplished. To survival, Thomas said, raising a cup of his bean wine. To more than survival, Margaret corrected, clinking her cup against his. To thriving. The wine was terrible, harsh and vegetal, but they drank it anyway, laughing at the awfulness of it, toasting their impossible garden, their cobbled-together home, their defiant persistence. As evening fell, Margaret walked through the garden one more time, checking plants with the automatic thoroughness of a farmer. Everything was growing well. The potato beds were producing continuously now with staggered planting. The beans were flowering again for a second crop. The wheat had been harvested, and they'd already prepared the beds for the next planting. The greenhouse was protecting their more delicate crops. She stopped at the memorial plaque they'd installed near the cabin entrance. A piece of metal Thomas had etched with careful precision. Dr. Kelsin Talveris, Zorath Agricultural Research Division, your work lives on. Margaret and Thomas Hayes, human colonists, LK247. They'd placed it there as a promise, a way of saying that his abandoned research hadn't been in vain, that someone had come after him, had continued the work, had proven that feeding people mattered. Thank you, Margaret said softly to the memory of a Zorath scientist she'd never met. You saved our lives. That night, well-fed and content, Margaret pulled out her journal. She'd been keeping detailed records of everything they'd done, planting schedules, crop yields, engineering solutions, weather patterns. Partly it was practical documentation, but partly it was history. Someday, someone might find this place, and if they did, they'd need to know what had happened here. Day 90, she wrote, 3 months since abandonment. The garden is thriving beyond our wildest expectations. We harvested our first wheat today, approximately 15 kilograms of grain. Combined with our potato production, bean crops and the underground hydroponics, we're generating enough food to support ourselves with surplus for preservation and seed stock. Thomas is healthy again, strong. I'm healthy. We work every day, but it's good work, meaningful work. We're not just surviving, we're building something permanent. Sometimes I think about Commander Velkaris and his calculations, 0.73%. That's what we represented to the Zorath Empire. A rounding error, a minor inefficiency. They looked at 2 elderly humans and saw nothing but resource drain. They couldn't calculate the value of experience, of knowledge accumulated over decades, of stubborn human determination. We've taken a dead moon and given it life. We've built paradise from ruins. And every day we continue, we prove that value can't be reduced to a number in a spreadsheet, that people aren't machinery to be discarded when they age, that life finds a way when given half a chance, and stubborn caretakers. If anyone ever reads this, know that Margaret Hayes and Thomas Hayes were here, that we mattered, that we built something beautiful on a moon that was meant to be our grave. She closed the journal and looked over at Thomas, who was sketching plans for the southern expansion by lamplight, his reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked up and caught her watching. What? He asked with a smile. Just thinking about how lucky I am, Margaret replied, that if I had to be abandoned on a dead moon, I got to do it with you. Well, when you put it that way, it sounds almost romantic. Thomas set down his pencil and came to sit beside her. You know what I think about? What? Michael and Sarah, the grandkids, what they'd think if they could see us now. His voice was wistful but not sad. I think they'd be proud. Their old parents refusing to go quietly. I think they'd say we're crazy, Margaret said with a laugh, and they'd be right, but also proud, yes. They sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of their garden, water trickling through channels, wind rustling through wheat stalks, the occasional call of a scalar in the distance. LK247 had its own voice now, its own life, and they were part of it. Day 95 brought an unexpected visitor. Margaret was tending the greenhouse when she heard Thomas shout her name with an urgency that sent her running. She found him standing at the edge of their property, pointing toward the sky. A ship, small, sleek, descending toward the plateau about a kilometer away. Not Zorath design, the lines were different, more angular. It touched down with a burst of atmospheric engines, kicking up a cloud of dust. Margaret and Thomas looked at each other, 1,000 unspoken questions passing between them. After 3 months of isolation, they were no longer alone. "We should go see who it is," Thomas said, but his hand instinctively found Margaret's, gripping tight. "Agreed, but carefully." Margaret's medical training kicked in, assessing possibilities. Could be another colony expedition. Could be salvagers. Could be anyone. They walked together toward the landed ship, their bodies tense with anticipation. As they drew closer, a boarding ramp extended, and figures emerged. Not Zorath. These were Krellians, a species Margaret recognized from the colony ship. Four-armed, blue-skinned, with bioluminescent patterns that shifted with their emotions. One of them spotted Margaret and Thomas and froze, then called out in heavily accented standard, "Are you human? Earth native?" "We are," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Margaret and Thomas Hayes. We've been here 3 months." The Krellians approached cautiously, their bioluminescence shifting to colors that Margaret thought indicated surprise or confusion. The leader, marked by more elaborate patterns, gestured at their garden with evident astonishment. "This is impossible," he said. "This moon was surveyed years ago, classified as uninhabitable, non-viable for colonization, and yet you have—" He gestured at the growing fields, the irrigation system, the greenhouse. "You have created agriculture." "How?" Thomas squeezed Margaret's hand gently before responding. "We didn't have a choice. We were left here to die, so we decided to live instead." The Krellian's bioluminescence flared bright orange. Shock, Margaret thought. "Left here? By who?" "Zorath Colony Expedition," Margaret said. 3 months ago. They deemed us non-productive due to age." The Krellians exchanged looks, their patterns shifting rapidly in what was clearly animated discussion. Finally, the leader turned back to them. "We are an independent trading vessel. We stop at this moon occasionally to check equipment caches." He gestured toward the distant wreckage. "But we have never seen this. You should not be alive. The survival probability was 17% over 5 years, Thomas interrupted. 0.73% mission impact. We know the calculations. We just didn't accept them." The Krellian stared at them for a long moment, then a sound emerged from his throat, something between a whistle and a laugh. "You are either very foolish or very remarkable, perhaps both." He looked around at the garden again. May we see what you have built? We carry news to many colonies. This story, humans surviving, thriving on an abandoned moon. This is a story that should be told." Margaret and Thomas exchanged a glance. They'd built this for themselves, for survival, but perhaps it could mean more. Perhaps their impossible garden could be proof that life, human or otherwise, couldn't be calculated away by bureaucrats more concerned with efficiency than potential. "Yes," Margaret said, "we'll show you everything. But first, would you like some bread? We just harvested our first wheat." The Krellian's bioluminescence shifted to a warm gold color that Margaret recognized as pleasure. "We would be honored to share your harvest." As they walked back toward the cabin, surrounded by aliens who'd expected to find nothing but ruins, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not just satisfaction at their survival, but purpose in sharing it. Their garden wasn't just food, it was a message that said, "We were here, we survived, we mattered." And that message, like the seeds they'd planted, was going to spread far beyond this small moon. The Krellian traders stayed for 2 days, and those 2 days changed everything. Captain Vensalix, the leader with the elaborate bioluminescent patterns, documented everything with meticulous detail. He recorded interviews, took imaging scans of the garden, collected samples of their crops, and asked endless questions about their methods, their timeline, their resources. "This is extraordinary," he said repeatedly, his forearms gesturing expressively as he examined their irrigation system. "Truly extraordinary. We have entire agricultural corporations with unlimited resources that struggle to establish viable farms on marginal worlds. And you two, with salvage and determination, created this in 3 months. 3.5 now," Thomas corrected, a hint of pride in his voice. He was showing Vensalix the solar array, explaining how he'd maximized power collection using adaptive positioning and reflective surfaces salvaged from debris. "And we had help, in a way. Dr. Talveris left us the foundation, the bunker, the seeds, the preserved knowledge." "Ah yes, Talveris." Vensalix's patterns shifted to a somber blue. "I knew of his work. He was brilliant, innovative. The Empire dismissed his research as unprofitable. Many of us in the independent trading guilds disagreed with that assessment." Margaret joined them, carrying fresh bread and preserved vegetables for lunch. They seem to dismiss a lot of things as unprofitable. The Empire calculates in quarters and fiscal years, Venzalix agreed. They cannot see value in long-term investment, in work that doesn't show immediate returns. It's one reason many of us chose independence over imperial service. He accepted the food gratefully. This bread is remarkable, by the way. The texture, the flavor. You've adapted the grain structure to the growing conditions here? Trial and error, Margaret said. A lot of error, actually. But yes, we've been selecting seeds from the best-performing plants each cycle. Natural adaptation enhanced by careful cultivation. Over their meal, Venzalix explained his purpose. I travel a circuit. 14 systems, 32 colonies and outposts. I carry goods, yes, but also information, news, stories. The galaxy is vast and communication infrastructure is expensive. Many colonies go months or years between official imperial updates. So, traders like me, we become the news network. And you want to tell our story, Thomas said. It wasn't a question. I want to share your story, Venzalix corrected. There is a difference. I will not sensationalize or distort. But yes, people need to know what happened here, what you accomplished. His patterns flickered between colors rapidly. There are millions of elderly beings across the galaxy who face the same calculation you did, deemed non-productive, resource negative, disposable. Your existence here proves that calculation is fundamentally flawed. Margaret felt the weight of that statement. They'd been fighting for their own survival, building their own refuge, but if their story could help others, could change minds about the value of elderly people, tell it, she said firmly. Tell it accurately. We didn't do anything heroic. We just worked. We used skills we'd accumulated over decades. We refused to accept that our lives were over just because someone with a spreadsheet said so. That, Venzalix said gently, is precisely what makes it heroic. Before the Krellians departed, they offered Margaret and Thomas several items, a long-range communicator, medical supplies, upgraded tools, even an offer to transport them to a proper colony if they wished. Thomas and Margaret discussed this in the privacy of their cabin, while the Krellians prepared their ship. We could leave, Thomas said quietly, go somewhere with proper medical care, easier living. We've proven our point. Margaret looked around their home. The shelves of preserved food, the herbs growing in the window, the comfortable bed they'd constructed, the journal documenting everything they'd learned. Through the window, she could see their garden spreading green across the grey landscape. Do you want to leave? She asked. Thomas was silent for a long moment. No, he finally said. This is ours. We built it. It's home now. Strange as that sounds. It's not strange. Margaret took his hand. We have more purpose here than we did on the colony ship. More freedom. We eat food we grew, live in a home we built. Answer to no one but ourselves and the seasons. She smiled. I think I'd miss it. The challenge of it, the satisfaction. Then we stay. They accepted the communicator. It seemed foolish to refuse contact with the wider galaxy and the medical supplies, which Margaret appreciated professionally, but they declined the offer of relocation. This is our home now, Margaret told Venzalix. We're not leaving. The Krellians' patterns shifted to warm gold. I thought you might say that. Then I will bring you supplies on my next circuit. In approximately 4 months. Seeds you might want, materials for expansion, news from beyond. Would that be acceptable? More than acceptable, Thomas said. That would be wonderful. As the Krellian ship lifted off, Margaret and Thomas watched from their garden, hands clasped. They were no longer alone in the galaxy, but they were still alone on LK-247, and that was exactly how they wanted it. The months that followed brought changes both gradual and profound. They expanded the southern growing area as planned, establishing a secondary farm that diversified their production and provided insurance against crop failures. Thomas engineered a more sophisticated water collection system that captured atmospheric moisture even more efficiently. Margaret experimented with cross-pollination, creating hybrid varieties better adapted to the moon's unique conditions. The communicator brought news, sporadic at first, then increasingly frequent. Word of their story was spreading through the independent trading networks. Other elderly colonists, facing the same resource calculations, sent messages asking for advice, for hope, for proof that life didn't end at the convenience of bureaucratic efficiency. Margaret and Thomas answered every message they could, sharing their techniques, their challenges, their successes. They became unexpectedly consultants in survival agriculture, their methods studied by colonies struggling with marginal environments. On day 150, they received a message that made Margaret's hands tremble as she read it. To Margaret and Thomas Hayes from the Independent Agricultural Collective, your work on LK-247 has inspired legislation proposals in 3 systems to prohibit age-based colony exclusions. Additionally, 7 colonies have implemented elder retention programs, recognizing the value of accumulated knowledge and skill. Your survival is not just personal, it is political. Thank you for being stubborn. Thank you for mattering. Thomas found her crying in the garden, the message clutched in her hand. Maggie, what's wrong? She showed him the message. He read it twice, then sat down heavily on the ground beside her. We changed things, he said, his voice filled with wonder. We actually changed things. We just wanted to live, Margaret whispered. We didn't mean to start a movement. Maybe that's exactly what makes it matter. Thomas put his arm around her. We didn't set out to prove a point. We just refused to die quietly. And that was enough. 4 months after the Krellians' first visit, Vensalix returned as promised. But he wasn't alone. His ship carried 3 passengers, all elderly beings from different species, all facing abandonment on various colony worlds. They wanted to see it for themselves, Vensalix explained, as the passengers disembarked. The impossible garden, the proof that age doesn't equal uselessness. Margaret and Thomas spent 2 days showing their visitors everything they'd built, answering questions, sharing techniques. An elderly Krellian woman named Esmatil wept openly when she saw the memorial to Dr. Talveris. I knew him, she said, her patterns flickering with grief and joy. We worked together before the Empire deemed my research unprofitable and forced retirement. He would be so proud of what you've done. A Draken elder, his scales dulled with age but his eyes sharp, studied their solar array with professional interest. This design is innovative. May I document it? My colony has been struggling with power distribution. Document everything, Thomas said generously. That's the whole point, isn't it? We're not building this just for us. We're building it for everyone who comes after. On the last evening before the visitors departed, they gathered around the outdoor table for a meal, a true feast of everything the garden produced. Roasted potatoes with herb garnish, fresh bread, bean stew, greens tossed with scala fat, even a rough wine Thomas had finally gotten right. Vensalix raised his cup in a toast, his patterns glowing warm and bright. To Margaret and Thomas Hayes, to refusing calculations, to building paradise from ruins, to mattering, everyone echoed, and the sound carried across the plateau, across the gardens that shouldn't exist, across a moon that had been deemed worthless. After the visitors left, Margaret updated her journal, her entries now more philosophical than purely documentary. Day 167. We've had visitors, not just observers but pilgrims, people who needed to see that survival was possible, that their accumulated years of knowledge and skill had value even when bureaucrats said otherwise. I'm 73 years old. Thomas is 75. By imperial calculations we should be dead, but we're not. We're thriving. And our thriving has become a symbol for others facing the same dismissal, the same reduction to efficiency metrics. I think about Commander Velkaris sometimes. I wonder if he knows what happened, if he knows that his 0.73% calculation missed everything that truly mattered. I'm not angry anymore. Anger is exhausting and unproductive, but I hope he knows. I hope he sees the reports, reads the legislation proposals, understands that his mathematics were incomplete. Value can't be calculated in quarterly projections. It's measured in gardens that bloom where nothing should grow, in knowledge shared across systems, in elderly hands that still create, still build, still matter. We are not resource drain. We are resource. And anyone who can't see that is using the wrong equation. One evening, 6 months after their abandonment, Margaret and Thomas stood at the highest point of their property, looking down at what they'd created. The garden stretched nearly a quarter kilometre now, organized into sectors: grains, vegetables, legumes, the greenhouse for delicate crops. Water glinted in the irrigation channels. The cabin, barely visible in the growing twilight, glowed with warm light. It's beautiful, Margaret said softly. I never imagined we'd build something so beautiful. Neither did I. Thomas's arm circled her waist. You know what the best part is? What? We get to keep doing it. Tomorrow we'll plant more. Next week we'll harvest. Next month we'll improve something. There's no end point, no retirement from this. We can keep building, keep growing, for as long as we're able. Margaret leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. 53 years of marriage, and he could still surprise her with his insight. That is the best part. Purpose without deadline. As the twin suns set and the stars emerged in the darkening sky, they walked back to their cabin. Not the ruin they'd been abandoned in, but the home they'd built. The garden whispered around them, alive and growing, proof that calculations could be wrong, and that human persistence could transform even the most hostile environment into something approaching paradise. They'd been discarded as useless. Instead, they'd become essential, not just to themselves but to countless others who needed to see that age didn't diminish value, only changed how that value manifested. Commander Velkaris had been right about one thing. Their names would not be forgotten. They were in the logs, archived, documented, but not as mortality projections, as farmers, as teachers, as proof that the Empire's calculations had missed the most important variable of all, the human refusal to accept someone else's assessment of their worth. And that variable, immeasurable and stubborn, had changed everything. 9 months. 273 days since Commander Velkaris had abandoned them on LK-247, with 40 days of expired rations and a 17% chance of rescue over 5 years. Margaret marked the milestone in her journal with a sense of quiet triumph that had become familiar, the daily satisfaction of proving the impossible wrong. The garden had evolved beyond anything they'd imagined in those desperate early days. What had started as survival agriculture had become something approaching art. Margaret had learned the moon's rhythms so intimately that she could predict frost patterns, optimize planting schedules, coax maximum yields from minimal resources. The southern expansion was producing abundantly now, and they'd even started a third growing zone to the east, experimenting with shade-tolerant varieties near a rocky outcrop. Thomas had become a master of adaptive engineering. Their power system now generated 3 times the original capacity. He'd built a functional workshop, constructed storage silos for grain, even created a rudimentary greenhouse automation system using salvaged sensors and clever mechanical linkages. At 75, his mind was sharper than ever, constantly solving problems, innovating solutions. They'd become famous, though neither particularly wanted the attention. Trading ships stopped regularly now, sometimes for supplies, sometimes just to see the legendary garden for themselves. Margaret and Thomas welcomed visitors graciously, but maintained their privacy, their routine, their quiet satisfaction in work that mattered. It was mid-morning on day 273 when the alarm Thomas had rigged to their perimeter sensors began to sound. Margaret was in the greenhouse, Thomas in the workshop. They met outside the cabin, both scanning the sky. A ship was descending, large, military configuration, and the design was unmistakably Zorath. Margaret felt her heart rate accelerate, not fear exactly, but something complex. Anticipation mixed with old anger, curiosity blended with defiance. Thomas reached for her hand and she gripped it tightly. The ship landed on the same plateau where they'd been abandoned 9 months earlier. It was massive compared to the trading vessels they'd grown accustomed to, a proper imperial cruiser, its purple-black hull gleaming with military polish. The boarding ramp extended with hydraulic precision, and down it walked Commander Velkaris. He looked exactly as Margaret remembered. Tall, imposing, his chitinous exoskeleton polished to perfection, his compound eyes reflecting the twin suns' light in unsettling patterns. But his mandibles weren't clicking with their usual mechanical certainty. They twitched irregularly, betraying what might have been uncertainty. Behind him came Siraket, the younger officer who'd been kind to Margaret during the voyage, and 3 others Margaret didn't recognize. They all stopped at the base of the ramp, staring at the transformed landscape with evident shock. Velkaris's translator crackled to life. "Margaret Hayes, Thomas Hayes, you are alive." "We are," Margaret said calmly, though her pulse was racing. Surprised. Velkaris seemed to struggle for words, his mandibles clicking rapidly. "The statistical probability was 17% over 5 years," Thomas interrupted. 0.73% mission impact. "We remember the numbers, Commander." Velkaris's gaze swept across the garden, the ordered rows of crops, the greenhouse gleaming in the sunlight, the irrigation channels, the solar arrays, the cabin that was no longer a ruin. His translator was silent for a long moment before he spoke again. "This is impossible." This moon was classified as non-viable for agricultural production. The soil composition, the atmospheric conditions, the temperature extremes. Our agricultural division assessed it as requiring minimum investment of 2 million credits and a team of 20 specialists for preliminary terraforming before any crop production could be attempted. Your agricultural division was wrong, Margaret said simply. Or rather, they were calculating for imperial standards. We were calculating for survival. Siraket stepped forward, her mandibles moving in what Margaret had learned was a Zorath expression of wonder. How? The resources you were given were inadequate by design, Thomas finished. But someone else left us resources. Dr. Talveris. He sealed a bunker full of agricultural research, seeds, equipment. He hoped someone would continue his work. We did. At the mention of Talveris's name, all 5 Zorath became completely still. Finally, Velkaris spoke, his voice carrying a tone Margaret had never heard from him before, something that might have been remorse. Dr. Talveris's project was terminated by imperial decree. His research was deemed inefficient. His research saved our lives, Margaret said firmly. His inefficient work proved that this moon could support agriculture, that elderly colonists deemed resource negative could not only survive, but thrive, that your calculations were fundamentally flawed. Velkaris's mandibles clicked in what Margaret now recognized as distress. You must understand, imperial policy requires optimization of resource allocation. The mathematics were incomplete, Thomas interrupted, his voice hard. You calculated calories consumed versus labor output. You factored in medical costs and space requirements, but you didn't calculate decades of accumulated knowledge. You didn't factor in human determination, or the value of experience, or the innovation that comes from necessity. Those variables don't fit neatly into spreadsheets, so you ignored them. And it nearly killed us, Margaret added. We starved for weeks because your optimized resource allocation gave us expired rations and broken equipment. Thomas collapsed from malnutrition. I had to hunt alien wildlife with medical tools because we had no other protein source. We survived despite your calculations, not because of them. Siraket spoke up, her voice tentative. Your story has reached Imperial Command. The independent traders have been broadcasting it across multiple systems. There have been political repercussions. Velkaris's mandibles clicked sharply, a gesture that silenced Siraket. But Margaret saw something in his posture that looked like resignation. 3 systems have passed legislation prohibiting age-based colony exclusions, he said flatly. The Independent Agricultural Collective has submitted a formal challenge to imperial resource allocation policies, and 7 separate colonies have filed complaints regarding the treatment of elderly colonists, using your case as precedent. He paused. The Empire has been forced to conduct a comprehensive review of all colony expedition protocols. Good, Margaret said simply. The Kepler 442b colony expedition, the one you were originally assigned to, has suffered significant setbacks, Velkaris continued, and now Margaret heard something definite in his voice. Shame. 3 systems failures, crop disease and internal conflicts have reduced our projected efficiency by 18%. We are currently behind schedule and over budget. The colony is viable, but struggling. Thomas made a sound that might have been a laugh. And you came back here looking for what? Sympathy, validation. We came because Command ordered a full assessment of this facility, Velkaris said, to determine if your success here was reproducible, if Dr. Talveris's research should be reinstated, if... He trailed off, mandibles twitching. If elderly colonists might actually be valuable after all, Margaret finished for him. Silence fell over the plateau. The wind whispered through wheat stalks. Water trickled in irrigation channels. Somewhere in the distance, a scala called out its territorial cry. Finally, Siraket spoke again, more boldly this time. May we see what you have built? Commander Velkaris has been ordered to conduct a full survey, but She paused. I would like to see it simply because it is remarkable, because you survived when we thought you could not. Margaret and Thomas exchanged glances. They could refuse. Could send the Zorath away with nothing but the view from the landing plateau. But what would that accomplish? You can see the garden, Margaret said finally. All of it. We'll answer your questions, share our methods, explain what we learned. But understand this, Commander. We're not doing it to help the Empire. We're doing it because other people, elderly people across the galaxy, deserve to know that survival is possible, that they have value, that bureaucrats and spreadsheets don't get the final word on who matters. Velkaris's mandibles clicked in what might have been agreement or acknowledgement. Understood. They spent the day showing the Zorath everything. Thomas explained the solar array, the water collection system, the irrigation network. Margaret walked them through the crop rotation strategy, the seed selection process, the soil amendment techniques. They showed them the bunker, still producing food underground, its hydroponics now perfectly balanced and self-sustaining. They showed them the memorial plaque honoring Dr. Talveris. Siraket traced the letters with one of her upper hands, her patterns shifting to deep blue. He would have been pleased to know his work continued. "We made sure it did," Margaret said. "That was the least we could do." As the twin sons began their descent, Margaret prepared a meal, simple but substantial. Fresh bread, roasted potatoes with herbs, bean stew, greens from the greenhouse. She served it to the Zorath crew with the same hospitality she'd shown to trading ship visitors, because that was who she was. Anger didn't mean cruelty. Proving a point didn't require pettiness. Velkaris ate slowly, his mandibles processing food with mechanical precision. When he finished, he was silent for a long moment before speaking. "I am a commander in the Imperial Fleet. I have conquered 17 systems, established 32 colonies, optimized resource allocation for populations exceeding 2 billion individuals. I have always believed in the mathematics, in efficiency, in calculated decision-making based on empirical data." He paused. "You have proven that my calculations were insufficient, that my understanding of value was incomplete." Margaret waited. This wasn't an apology. Velkaris likely wasn't capable of one, but it was acknowledgement. And that mattered. "Your survival and success here will be documented in my report," Velkaris continued. "I will recommend reinstatement of Dr. Talveris's research protocols, revision of colony selection criteria, and establishment of what you call elder retention programs across all Imperial expeditions." His compound eyes fixed on Margaret and Thomas. "This will not undo what was done to you, but perhaps it will prevent it from happening to others." "That's all we can ask," Thomas said quietly. Velkaris stood, his movements formal, precise. "We will depart at first light. Your facility will be classified as an active agricultural research station under independent operation. You will have official Imperial recognition, which will provide legal protections and priority access to supply lines should you require them." "We don't want Imperial oversight," Margaret said firmly. "You will not have it. This designation ensures you are left alone to continue your work without interference." Velkaris's mandibles clicked. "It is the least the Empire can offer after what occurred here." That night, after the Zorath had returned to their ship, Margaret and Thomas sat outside their cabin under the stars, wrapped in their thermal blanket even though the nights were no longer as cold as they'd once been. The garden had changed the microclimate, just as Thomas had predicted. Everything was changing, slowly but inexorably. "Do you think he understood?" Margaret asked. "Really understood?" "I think he understood that his calculations failed," Thomas replied. "Whether he understands why, whether he grasps that people aren't reducible to numbers, I don't know. Maybe that's beyond him. But he acknowledged the failure. That's something. It's not enough. No. But it's a start." Thomas squeezed her hand. "And we didn't do this for apologies or acknowledgement. We did it to survive. Everything else, the legislation, the inspiration, the vindication, that's just a bonus." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. 9 months ago, they'd been dying on this plateau. Now they were thriving, and their thriving had rippled outward in ways they never could have predicted. "I've been thinking about Michael and Sarah," she said softly. "About what they'd think if they knew. They'd think their parents were stubborn as hell," Thomas said with a chuckle. "And they'd be right. Do you think we'll ever see them again?" "I don't know. Probably not. FTL travel is expensive, and Earth is very far away." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "But they'll hear the story. Everyone's hearing the story. And they'll know that their parents mattered, that we built something beautiful, that we didn't go quietly. That's enough. It has to be." The next morning, the Zorath ship departed just after dawn. Velkaris said no formal goodbye, simply nodded once to Margaret and Thomas before boarding. But Siraket lingered, her patterns shifting through colors rapidly. "Thank you," she said simply, "for showing us this, for surviving, for mattering." After the ship was gone, a bright point of light climbing toward the stars, Margaret and Thomas returned to their routine. The garden needed tending, the greenhouse required monitoring. Life continued, with all its daily demands and satisfactions. Margaret updated her journal one final time. Day 274. The Zorath returned. "Commander Velkaris saw what we built, and acknowledged his calculations were wrong. The Empire will revise its policies. Other elderly colonists will have better chances because we refuse to die quietly. We are still here, still farming, still growing food on a moon that was supposed to be our grave. And we will continue to be here, for as long as our bodies allow, building our impossible garden and proving every day that value cannot be reduced to a number. Thomas just called from the south field. The wheat is ready for another harvest. Life continues. Beautiful, ordinary, impossible life. We were abandoned by aliens who calculated our worth and found it insufficient. In response, we turned a wrecked moon cabin into paradise, not for revenge, not for vindication, simply because we refused to accept someone else's assessment of what we could accomplish. If anyone reads this years from now, know this: Margaret and Thomas Hayes lived here. We mattered, we survived, we thrived, and our garden still grows, green and stubborn and alive, proof that the most important things in life cannot be calculated, only cultivated, with patient hands, with stubborn hearts, with the absolute refusal to give up. That is our legacy. That is our triumph. That is our paradise found. She closed the journal, set down her pen and walked outside to join Thomas in the wheat field. The twin suns warmed her face. The wind carried the scent of growing things, and all around her the garden stretched green and abundant, a testament to human persistence in the face of impossible odds. They had been discarded as worthless. Instead, they had become invaluable. And every day they woke on LK-247, every seed they planted, every harvest they gathered, was proof that the universe's calculations were incomplete. Because some things, dignity, purpose, the stubborn determination to matter, could never be reduced to a percentage, could never be optimized away, could never be abandoned. They were Margaret and Thomas Hayes. They were 73 and 75 years old. They were farmers on a dead moon, and they were not finished growing. Not yet. Not ever. The end.